Jason Barlow had no illusions about what peace and quiet meant. When he purchased the old brick house on the outskirts of Northcrest, he wasn't chasing dreams or running from a past. He simply wanted control over his own land. The property had a strange reputation in town. Locals called it the Valve House, a leftover label from decades ago when the structure served as a water distribution control point for the nearby district. Most people avoided it, claiming it was too close to the utility lines, too isolated, too problematic. But Jason saw what others didn't. A self-sufficient lot with its own underground well system, reinforced basement, and direct access to a water loop still used by the surrounding blocks. It was infrastructure disguised as real estate, and to Jason it was perfect. He closed on the property without much fanfare, paying in full and securing all records through a lawyer he'd trusted from his business days. Jason was no fool. He knew how land deals could turn dirty. For 20 years, he had run a company specializing in commercial water tank installations. He understood blueprints, flow systems, and more importantly, the bureaucratic maze that came with them. So when the agent muttered something vague about local residential management oversight, Jason waved it off. He'd dealt with inspectors, regulators, and angry committees before. A few neighborly noses wouldn't bother him. The first few months were calm. He spent his days reinforcing the property, welding hinges, replacing old pressure gauges, and clearing out invasive tree roots that threatened the underground valves. The previous owner had clearly neglected the place, and the basement control room looked like it hadn't been touched since the 1980s. Jason found dusty maps rolled into a filing cabinet, several marked with red ink lines labeled Municipal Bypass and Pressure Isolation Sector C. They made little sense without context, but he kept them anyway. You didn't throw away documents like that, especially not when half the homes uphill still relied on pressure supplied through old city-era pipework. His first run-in with the local committee came on a Thursday. A woman named Karen Hopper, easily over 250 pounds and covered in gaudy jewelry, knocked on his door with a plastic clipboard in one hand and a smirk that never quite reached her eyes. She welcomed him with the energy of someone delivering a veiled threat. She spoke about community cohesion, shared responsibilities, and mandatory integration into the neighborhood oversight structure. Jason didn't like her tone, nor her assumption that she had authority. He politely declined whatever membership she was pushing, but she pressed on, insisting that the property fell under their jurisdiction by infrastructure alignment. Jason said nothing, just looked her in the eye until she got uncomfortable. When she finally left, her parting words were a saccharine. "We always keep track of who participates and who doesn't." That was the first moment Jason realized this wouldn't be a normal homeownership experience. He wasn't just living at the edge of a neighborhood, he was standing in the middle of something others thought they controlled. And they didn't like that someone like him wasn't playing along. 3 months after moving in, Jason received an envelope that didn't look like the usual junk or monthly flyers about neighborhood events. It was cream-colored, thick-stocked, and unmarked. No return address, no branding, just his name printed in oddly formal font. He opened it at the kitchen counter with the same casualness he applied to most mail, but as he unfolded the contents and read the first paragraph, his grip on the paper tightened. According to the letter, his property had been legally transferred to a holding company named Sterling Community Services, LLC, due to delinquent payments related to utility stabilization fees. The language was dry and bureaucratic, but the message was clear. Someone had sold his house out from under him. At first he thought it was a scam, one of those fake notices meant to scare people into calling a number or wiring money. But the details were specific. The letter referenced the full parcel ID, county records, and a sale date just 10 days prior. It stated that, due to unpaid contributions to the district's infrastructure fund, the property had been forfeited in accordance with community regulatory guidelines. The amount owed was listed as $8,140.74. Jason had never received a single bill or notice about such a fee. There had been no invoices, no warnings, not even a late slip. The only utility he paid for was electricity. His water was technically independent. He had no meter, no municipal contract, and no agreement with any residential committee. He owned the system beneath his house. So where the hell was this debt coming from? He drove straight to the county office the next morning, arriving just as the building opened. The clerk at the land records department was polite but indifferent, treating his questions with the kind of practiced detachment that comes from dealing with upset property owners all day. After pulling up the digital file on her screen, she confirmed it. His property had been transferred. The record showed that the title had been relinquished due to non-compliance with local utility alignment protocol and included a scanned form with Jason's printed name. His signature, however, was nowhere on it. That was when he realized how far this had gone without his knowledge. Some administrative function, likely buried in local regulations, had allowed this group, this committee or whatever they called themselves, to file a lien or initiate a transfer under the guise of public infrastructure management. Jason demanded copies of everything and spent the rest of the day at the courthouse, poring over documents, making calls, and contacting his attorney. The attorney, Harold Dobbs, a measured and slow-talking man who'd helped Jason settle the purchase, was shocked. "This isn't just a lien," Harold said after reading through the paperwork. "They've reclassified your home as a utility asset. That's why the court didn't stop it. It was pushed through under regulatory exemption clauses." Jason's blood boiled. They hadn't just claimed he owed money. They had decided that his house, his land, and the system beneath it belonged to the community and had invoked municipal-style procedures to take it. But the so-called community wasn't the city or state. It was a private organization fronting as a neighborhood management group, led by a woman who had once handed him a clipboard and smiled like a predator. Karen Hopper. Her name was on every one of the forms. She had filed the initial debt notice, certified the assessment, and requested the title reassignment. Sterling Community Services? A shell company registered to her husband's business address. Jason didn't scream or pace or punch walls. He just sat still for a long moment in Harold's office, rereading the notice. When he finally spoke, his voice was level. "They're stealing my house under the pretense of public service. They're trying to make it look like I forfeited it voluntarily. And they think I won't fight because it's all paper trails and signatures." Harold nodded but warned him. "They're good at this. You're not the first to be targeted. You might be the first who's actually positioned to stop them, though." That night, Jason returned home to find a bright yellow sign staked into the front lawn. It read, "Property transfer pending. Entry restricted." His porch light had been unscrewed, the door handle smeared with something greasy, and the lock had fresh scratch marks around the keyhole. Someone had been trying to intimidate him, maybe even break in. There was no mistaking the message. He was being pushed out not through violence but through red tape, staged technicalities, and petty harassment designed to frustrate him into submission. But what they didn't realize was that Jason had spent 2 decades dealing with corporate sabotage, municipal backroom deals, and legal loopholes twisted into weapons. They thought they were pressuring a homeowner. In reality, they had just declared a bureaucratic war on a man who knew how to fight one back, with silence, precision, and unforgiving intent. Jason didn't sleep much that night. The sign staked into his front lawn glowed like a warning flare in his mind every time he closed his eyes. It wasn't just a message, it was a declaration, one that told him he was already considered gone. He woke before dawn, dressed without thought, and spent the early hours reviewing every document Harold had given him. The paper trail wasn't vague, it was dense, deliberate, and designed to crush resistance through technical exhaustion. The neighborhood committee hadn't just filed a lien. They had maneuvered his home into a reclassification zone, using local ordinances tied to infrastructure compliance. It was a calculated process that required signatures, false notices, and procedural loopholes. They'd done it before, Harold said, but only in places where the homeowner was disconnected, elderly, or simply unaware until it was too late. Jason was neither. The first step wasn't dramatic, it was legal. Jason, with Harold's help, filed a motion for emergency injunction, temporarily halting the sale and reclaiming standing rights over the property. The judge, seeing that the signature on the reassignment form didn't match any verified signature of Jason's, granted the delay. It was only a 30-day stay, but it was enough to buy time. That same morning, Jason contacted a private civil engineer, someone unaffiliated with the city or the committee, and requested an evaluation of the underground water system that ran through his property. He needed proof, technical and certified, that his home's foundation still hosted a functional and active valve node linked to the broader water network. 3 days later, the engineer came, a sharp woman named Reena Patel, who had experience in utility litigation cases. She brought high-resolution blueprints, pressure monitors, and a forensic tech to map the flow. What they found didn't surprise Jason, but it angered him. His property sat directly on top of a primary pressure buffer for the eastern grid of the district. The system hadn't been used in any official capacity since the 1990s, publicly anyway, but Reena confirmed that several outbound pipelines were still active, drawing pressure that fed into several blocks west of Jason's lot. That explained the red lines and notes he'd found in the basement. His home, in practical terms, was a choke point for water access, and whoever controlled it had leverage over multiple homes and businesses down the line. While Reena ran tests, a white pickup truck parked across the street. 2 men sat inside, not even trying to hide their surveillance. They were dressed like contractors, safety vests and work boots, but they never lifted a tool. They watched. Jason made no attempt to confront them. He simply noted their presence, took pictures of the plates, and moved on. He had seen enough soft intimidation in his professional life to recognize the tactic. It was meant to wear him down, to make him feel surrounded. That afternoon, the real push came. A team of 3 men in municipal-looking uniforms arrived at his property, claiming to be conducting a compliance inspection. They carried printed badges, generic clipboards, and an air of self-importance. When Jason asked for credentials, they ignored the request. One of them, tall and thin with a drawl too polished to be authentic, told him the inspection was non-negotiable under Ordinance 5C9. Jason informed them that 5C9 pertained to multi-dwelling fire sprinkler inspections, not single-family homes. He then told them to leave his property immediately or he'd file trespassing charges. The men left, but not before one of them whispered, "Hope your pipes hold up through the weekend." That evening, Jason walked the perimeter of his home and discovered that the external valve box had been tampered with. The screws were half loosened, and someone had tried to lever the cover open. He replaced the bolts with tamper-proof steel and welded a secondary guard over the main shutoff. Then, with painstaking patience, he disassembled his irrigation subline to check for tracking devices or pressure bugs. Nothing turned up, but the feeling of being targeted never left. Meanwhile, Harold was digging through property filings and internal committee communications that had been subpoenaed during the injunction. What he found was even more disturbing. Months before Jason had moved in, there had been internal emails between Karen Hopper and a man named Russell Deems, who operated a property transition consultancy affiliated with Sterling Community Services. They had discussed the valve house in coded but direct language, calling it an opportunity with hydraulic oversight potential and a strategic reclaim for long-term infrastructure autonomy. There were plans, literal maps, showing an intention to isolate the property's control systems and integrate them into a central monitoring station operated by the committee. That wasn't negligence or overreach. That was premeditated expropriation. Jason realized the committee never cared about the actual fee they claimed he owed. The 8 EYC $40 was a pretext. What they wanted was control. Not of his house, but of the water pressure, of the valves, of the grid that ran beneath his land. In the context of a suburban street, that sounded paranoid. But for a man who'd spent years watching municipalities privatize and manipulate infrastructure, it was all too familiar. The next morning, his mailbox was missing. Not broken, not vandalized. Just gone. Cleanly removed from the post. His driveway had fresh tire tracks, thicker than his own truck's, and someone had left a sealed envelope under a rock by his door. Inside was a copy of a final forfeiture notice with a red-stamped line reading, "Residential interruption scheduled." There was no sender, no signature, just a date, 1 week from now. Jason didn't react. He just called Reena, confirmed the last of her findings, and sent Harold a message. "They're coming next week. Make sure we're ready." Because now it wasn't about the house. It was about cutting off whoever thought they could use his land as their private switchboard. And he was done playing nice. Jason spent the following days preparing in silence. Not in fear or in haste, but with calculated purpose. He had no interest in confrontation unless it was unavoidable, and he wasn't about to give anyone the satisfaction of watching him panic. He changed every lock on the property, installed remote-controlled deadbolts on the basement access door, and repositioned 2 trail cameras to cover the road and rear property line. It wasn't paranoia. It was protocol. After years in the utility contracting world, he'd learned that when a structure became the focus of interest for multiple parties, the attacks rarely came in the form of an official letter. They came quietly, often masked as routine or technical necessity, until one day the door just didn't open anymore and someone else's name was on the records. He wasn't about to let that happen. While Harold continued pressing the court for a broader injunction, Jason received an unexpected call. A woman from the Office of Utility Oversight had seen the engineer's report submitted by Reena Patel. She said the findings raised serious questions about how the neighborhood's infrastructure had been integrated into the private land without municipal oversight. She asked for permission to visit the site. Jason, ever cautious, agreed only if Harold or Reena were present. The meeting was set for Thursday morning. 2 nights before, just past 2 a.m., Jason's security light near the rear fence flickered to life. He watched from his darkened living room as 2 figures moved near the far edge of his property. They wore plain clothes, carried no tools, and made no attempt to approach the house. Instead, they circled the utility access hatch and lingered for several minutes. Jason didn't go out to confront them. He didn't grab a flashlight. He let the cameras do the watching, and the next morning, he uploaded the footage to a secure server, sending copies to Harold and Reena with a short note. They're probing. The meeting with the utility oversight officer, Ms. Lovett, was formal and tense. She was professional, middle-aged, and clearly knew her way around regulation. Reena was already on site when Jason walked her through the valve room. The air was thick with the smell of old metal and dust, but the gauges, piping, and main control frame were intact. Reena laid out the updated readings: pressure distribution maps, line connectivity, residual flow analysis. Miss Lovett took her time studying them, occasionally asking sharp, informed questions. At the end, she removed her glasses and said plainly, "This system is active. You're supplying pressure to over 60 properties, and no one disclosed this at sale?" Jason shook his head. "No one even mentioned it. They sold me a house, not a public utility." Ms. Lovett frowned. "This should have been classified as restricted use infrastructure. This isn't just a zoning error. This looks intentional." That word stuck with Jason long after she left. Intentional. It meant someone had known. Someone had understood the implications and had decided to hide them. Not through sloppy record-keeping or an outdated database, but with purpose. Harold confirmed that same night what Jason suspected. A backdoor zoning reclassification had been pushed through the land use registry 6 months prior, just days before Jason closed on the property. The name attached to the proposal? Russell Deems, the same man from the consultancy linked to Karen Hopper. That document hadn't gone through a public hearing. It had been rubber-stamped under a Community Utility Stabilization Act, meant for emergency waterline rerouting after natural disasters. It was never supposed to apply to residential properties. Jason felt the full scope of the congealing trap around him. They had set the snare long before he'd even seen the property listing. Everything from the sale to the ownership transfer was structured like a layered legal ambush. The moment he missed a false fee or questioned the wrong signature, they could sweep in and retake the land. No lawsuits, no warnings, just pure procedural erasure. But they had made one mistake. They assumed he wouldn't look below the surface. They assumed he was just another man moving into the suburbs to escape something, not someone who understood exactly how systems were manipulated from the inside. The next day, Jason walked into the basement and stared at the control panel. A section labeled Emergency Bypass had always puzzled him. It was old tech, pre-digital, with manual locks and pressure relays that no longer appeared connected. But as he traced the panel's wires with a handheld meter, he realized something chilling. The circuit was live. It was dormant but energized. That meant it was connected, somewhere, somehow, to an active system. He traced the conduit across the wall and into the ceiling, where it disappeared behind a support beam. Upstairs, in the hallway closet, he pulled away drywall that had clearly been patched in recent years. Behind it ran a narrow copper line and a tagged fiber conduit marked with a red sticker. Sterling Node 4C. Jason didn't know exactly what it controlled, but now he knew what it meant. Someone had been in this house long before he bought it, installing a secondary network access point into the pressure system, one that bypassed manual control. This wasn't just oversight, it was a ghost tap, a silent override. If they ever wanted to shut him out completely, they didn't need a locksmith or a court order. They just needed to activate the node. Jason stepped back, wiped the dust from his hands, and looked out the front window toward the street. The white pickup was there again. Karen wasn't visible, but he knew she was behind this. All of it. The paperwork, the engineers, the stalking. She was playing long-term, working every system she could bend. And now he had only two options. Let the trap close around him or take control of the one thing they never expected him to touch. The water. Jason didn't move immediately. He spent the weekend like a man settling into a strategy, studying every valve, every outdated panel, every inch of pipe that fed out from the main control system beneath his house. He wasn't interested in destroying anything. That would be reckless and, more importantly, temporary. What he needed was precision. The goal wasn't chaos, it was leverage. He knew the neighborhood couldn't function without the water supply his property regulated. And now that he understood the illegal backdoor tap into the system, he had no reason to continue pretending to be a passive player in someone else's game. For days, he worked with Rena quietly, rerouting a pressure lockout using a bypass that had been disabled long ago. It was an old mechanical override, entirely offline from the newer fiber-linked node that Sterling had installed. Once triggered, it would shut down all outbound flow from the node to the grid. Not with an explosion or a dramatic burst, but with a slow, clean, undeniable drop in pressure, like a heart monitor flatlining. On Monday morning, Jason triggered it. The effect wasn't immediate, but by afternoon, local forums were filled with complaints about low water pressure, sputtering faucets, and in some homes, complete shutdown. The district's maintenance office issued a boilerplate statement blaming temporary infrastructure recalibration. Jason didn't say a word, didn't respond to calls, and didn't open the door when someone knocked. He waited exactly as he expected until the third day, when they came not as city engineers but as representatives of the neighborhood committee. They didn't come politely. Two unmarked trucks arrived, both white, both driven by men Jason had seen before circling the block. One of them knocked, the other stayed by the vehicle. The one at the door didn't introduce himself. He simply informed Jason that due to a critical neighborhood emergency, his system required inspection and reactivation for community stability. Jason refused. He didn't offer an explanation, nor raise his voice. He simply said the system was shut down for certified maintenance, and that all communications must go through his attorney. The man didn't take it well. He leaned in, closer than necessary, and said with a quiet bite, "You've made this personal. You'll regret that." An hour later, Jason received a notice taped to his front gate. It was signed by Karen Hopper herself and titled Formal Allegation of Endangerment. The contents were absurd, claiming Jason's intentional disruption of water services endangered elderly residents, infants, and the immunocompromised, and that he had committed a form of domestic sabotage. She even cited a fictitious code from a community charter that legally had no enforcement mechanism. But Jason knew this wasn't about codes. It was a bluff. A loud, panicked, overreaching bluff. Karen was losing grip. The committee's illusion of control had always relied on people complying out of confusion or fear. But once Jason showed he understood the infrastructure better than they did, they lost their most valuable weapon: ambiguity. Now they were cornered, and cornered people made mistakes. That evening, Harold informed him that a temporary court ruling had acknowledged Jason's ownership of the mechanical control systems under his property and granted him full rights to manage and maintain them as long as it didn't violate municipal law. It was a critical win, one that shielded Jason from criminal retaliation while allowing him to remain fully in charge of the system. Still, Karen wasn't finished. The next morning, Jason woke to the sound of metallic scraping outside. He looked through the window and saw a crew unloading trenching equipment. No uniforms, no visible ID. He stepped outside and asked what they were doing. A man with a clipboard, clearly uncomfortable, explained they had an expedited service order to reroute a feeder line beneath Jason's property edge to reduce dependency on the failed system. Jason asked who signed the order. The man muttered SC Services, then immediately added, "We were told to expect cooperation." Jason informed them they were trespassing and had 60 seconds to leave before law enforcement was contacted. The crew hesitated, then backed off without confrontation. The lines had been crossed now, and Jason was done with warnings. That night, he removed the access panel to the fiber node hidden in the wall and used a portable jammer to kill its signal. It wasn't destructive, it simply cut off any remote commands from outside systems. Without it, the committee couldn't use their override tools or false signals to manipulate the pressure. Everything now came directly through Jason's hand-locked mechanical lines. He also replaced the main shutoff key with a custom bolt latch mechanism that required a fabricated tool only he had access to. The system was no longer theirs, it was his, and he wasn't giving it back. But Karen retaliated the way people like her always do, publicly and dishonestly. She held a community meeting at the local fire station, using a mix of emotional manipulation and invented crisis to sway the narrative. Video clips circulated online showing her sobbing about a dangerous man isolating the neighborhood, how she feared for the safety of children, and accusing Jason of terroristic control over utilities. It was performance, pure and theatrical, designed for neighbors who didn't know the facts or didn't care. But Jason wasn't trying to win popularity. He wasn't a politician. He was a landowner defending what he rightfully controlled. Still, the pressure rose. Someone poisoned his flower beds with salt. His truck windshield was smashed one night while he was asleep. The power to his garage was mysteriously cut, and a complaint was filed with the city accusing him of storing hazardous materials in his basement. He documented everything, sent copies to Harold, and filed incident reports for every infraction. He knew better than to lash out. Instead, he kept building his case. Then came the subpoena. It was delivered in person by a process server, a formal civil action filed by the neighborhood committee, accusing Jason of obstruction, sabotage, emotional harm, and unlawful seizure of shared property. They wanted a forced, court-ordered reinstatement of the water node and, incredibly, sought damages for stress inflicted upon the neighborhood. Harold called it laughable but serious. It was the committee's last play, a desperate bid to paint Jason as a rogue actor rather than what he was, a man who simply said no. But Jason didn't flinch. He reviewed the documents in silence, looked out across the now dry sprinkler systems across the block, and said calmly, "They built their whole system on my land, without my consent. I'm not the problem. I'm the consequence." The courtroom was sterile and quiet, the kind of space designed to strip emotion from every argument and reduce years of conflict to folders, cross-examinations, and time limits. Jason sat beside Harold at the defendant's table, his expression unmoved, his eyes following every gesture made by the woman sitting across from him. Karen Hopper had dressed for spectacle, powder blue blazer, black slacks that strained at the seams, and a pearl necklace that did little to soften the theatrical outrage in her voice. She sat with her attorney, a man more accustomed to handling HOA fee disputes than a case involving disputed infrastructure authority, and with every sentence he delivered, it became clear that their entire position was built on shaky assumptions and exaggerated grievances. They had filed their motion hastily, relying on emotion and community sentiment, trying to paint Jason as a malicious saboteur who had intentionally jeopardized the well-being of the neighborhood. But the more they pushed that narrative, the more it began to unravel under the weight of facts. Harold, calm and precise, dismantled their case point by point. He presented the original title deeds, clearly showing that Jason's property included the underground valve chamber and main pipeline inlet. He introduced the engineering assessments from Reena Patel, verifying that the mechanical controls operated independently from any city or committee-controlled network. He walked the judge through the zoning documents that had been quietly altered by Sterling Community Services, exposing their misuse of emergency infrastructure acts to mask illegal reclassification. But the most devastating blow came when Harold introduced the internal emails, secured via subpoena, from Karen and her associate Russell Deems, where they discussed how to gradually reclaim pressure access from Jason's property through backdoor, documentation, and controlled lien pressure. Karen's face flushed a mottled shade of red when the emails were read aloud. The courtroom was silent as the words "leverage system bypass" and "keep him in the dark until final notice" echoed off the walls. For a moment, she looked smaller, not physically, but in posture, shrinking beneath the weight of her exposed scheme. Her attorney tried to object, citing context and interpretation, but the damage was done. The judge, a seasoned man with no tolerance for manipulation, leaned forward and asked a simple question. Ms. Hopper, were you aware that the infrastructure you sought to control was technically and legally not under your jurisdiction? Karen mumbled something vague and the judge cut her off. Because based on the documentation presented, it appears that your committee, under your direction, initiated a fraudulent reclassification and used that pretense to forcibly seize property access. The room was quiet again, but the energy had shifted. Jason remained still, his expression unreadable. But inside he felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. Not joy. He wasn't a man driven by petty victory, but validation. He had been right not to fold, not to walk away when the pressure mounted. They had pushed him to the edge, used every tool at their disposal to isolate, intimidate, and break him. And now they sat exposed under the stark white lights of legal reality. The judge ruled swiftly. The committee's claims were dismissed in their entirety. The court recognized Jason's full ownership of the land, the infrastructure beneath it, and the mechanical systems in place. The reclassification documents were voided, and a separate motion was filed for potential criminal investigation into Sterling's activities. Karen, now visibly sweating, tried to leave with some dignity, but the clerk handed her a copy of the court's order as she passed, and her hand trembled as she took it. But the real culmination didn't come in that room. It came the next day when a city crew, accompanied by 2 municipal auditors, arrived to perform a full review of all utility integrations along the committee's grid. Jason allowed them onto the edge of his property with Harold present. The auditors found unauthorized taps in 3 locations, rerouted pressure paths illegally accessing his system, and a hidden relay unit buried near Karen's back fence. It was a covert fail-safe, designed to switch flow back through Jason's line if the main system failed. The crew removed it under supervision. By that evening, the local news had picked up the story, not because Jason called them, but because the city made a statement. A private citizen's utility system was unlawfully integrated into community operations. This will not be tolerated. Jason watched the report on mute. He didn't need to hear the words. He already knew how it would play. Karen would become a footnote. The committee would be restructured under new oversight, and the neighborhood would return to a quiet, begrudging state of normalcy. But nothing would be quite the same. Everyone knew now that Jason Barlow wasn't just a property owner. He was the man who shut down the water. When the crew was finished and the relay removed, Jason walked down to the basement one final time. He stood in front of the valve system and flipped a single switch, just one. The pressure resumed, slowly, smoothly, exactly as intended. He restored the water not because he had to, but because it was his to give. And that, more than any court ruling, was the last word. The weeks that followed unfolded with a strange quietness, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, unsure how to proceed in the aftermath of everything that had been exposed. Karen Hopper disappeared from public view almost overnight. Her social media pages were locked down, her house lights rarely turned on, and the once daily HOA-style courtesy patrols she had orchestrated ceased altogether. Word eventually spread that she had stepped down from the committee under the polite language of health and personal reasons. Though everyone knew it was more about avoiding the formal inquiries now circling Sterling Community Services. The company itself was under review, its licenses suspended pending investigation, and city officials had already begun auditing every contract and land file they had touched in the last 5 years. Jason didn't celebrate, didn't gloat, and didn't start hosting barbecues with the same neighbors who had watched in silence as the committee tried to grind him down. He kept his routines quiet and deliberate, walking the perimeter of his land each morning with the same calm watchfulness he'd adopted during the first weeks of trouble. A few neighbors offered half-hearted nods when they passed, some too embarrassed to speak, others still unsure whether they feared or respected him. He didn't mind. Respect built on silence was better than the kind built on false smiles. He met once more with Rena to finalize the reclassification of the property, not back into a public utility zone, but into a newly defined class of privately managed legacy infrastructure. It was a legal safeguard that would prevent any future, attempts at administrative seizure without direct judicial intervention. The system would remain under his control, and he'd set the terms for any usage or access moving forward. The city offered to buy it from him outright, but he declined. Not because of greed or spite, but because he'd earned every inch of the ground they had tried to steal. Some things you don't put a price on. On a cool Sunday evening, as dusk settled over the neighborhood, Jason sat on his back porch watching the sprinkler heads rise in synchronized silence across his yard. Water flowed, pressure restored, quiet reigned. It wasn't victory he felt, not exactly. It was something slower, heavier, justice perhaps in its most patient form. No headlines, no applause, just the knowledge that when they tried to steal from him, bury him in paperwork, strip him of what was his, he didn't run. He didn't fold. He held the valve. And when the time came, he turned it off.